What if everything you were told was permanent, wasn't? What if a royal birthright, something written into history before a child can even walk or talk, could simply vanish? Not with a vote, not with a coronation, but quietly, decisively, with one move. Because just moments ago, and yes, when we say moments, we mean the kind of moment that changes the course of a family forever. The royal family made an announcement that has left even seasoned palace watchers stunned. And at the center of it all are two children. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Children who never chose the spotlight, never chose the titles, never chose the drama. Yet today, their names are suddenly being whispered with words like revoked, removed, and excluded. So let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. Can a royal child be erased from history without ever stepping into a courtroom? Because if the reports are true, that is exactly what has just happened. This wasn't announced with trumpets. It didn't come with a balcony appearance. There was no smiling wave, no carefully staged photo. Instead, it arrived the way the most dangerous royal decisions always do. Quietly, clinically, and with language so precise, most people didn't even realize what they were reading at first. But once the meaning landed, everything changed. According to sources close to the palace, Prince William has made a move no future king has ever dared to make so openly, revoking Prince Harry's children's place in the royal line of succession. Let that sink in. Not adjusting their roles, not redefining expectations, not pausing their status, removing them, as if a line was drawn, and then erased. And suddenly, the question is no longer about tradition. It's about power. Because succession is not symbolic. It's not just names on a dusty list tucked away in some archive. Succession determines legitimacy. It determines funding. It determines protection, influence, and history itself. And once you are removed from that line, there is no easy way back. Now here's where things get even more unsettling. This move didn't happen in isolation. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a moment when the royal family is already walking a tightrope, balancing public pressure, internal fractures, and a future that looks nothing like the past. And that's why this story matters now. Not last year. Not 5 years from now. Right now. Because timing, in the monarchy, is everything. And the timing of this decision raises questions no one inside the palace seems eager to answer publicly. Why now? Why these children? Why this level of finality? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, who is this decision really aimed at? On the surface, the focus is on Archie and Lilibet, two names that have become lightning rods for debate, commentary, and controversy despite their age. But anyone who understands how royal power works knows something important. The monarchy never moves against children unless the real target is an adult. This is not about bedtime stories or school runs. This is about control. This is about drawing a line that cannot be crossed again. And insiders are quietly suggesting that what we're seeing is not just a family dispute, but a warning, a message, a recalibration of what loyalty, distance, and consequence mean in the modern monarchy. Now think about this for a second. For centuries, royal succession has been treated as sacred. It survived wars. It survived abdications. It survived scandal after scandal. Even when kings gave up thrones, even when heirs disgraced themselves, the children, especially the innocent ones, were usually left untouched, protected by tradition, protected by optics, protected by the unspoken rule that children should not be punished for adult choices. So what changed? What pushed the future king to step into territory that past monarchs avoided at all costs? Because this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This was calculated. Sources say the language used in the announcement was reviewed again and again. Every word weighed. Every implication tested. Because once something like this is said, once it's acknowledged, it cannot be unsaid. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. The announcement doesn't just remove names. It removes expectations. It rewrites futures. It quietly reshapes how history books may one day describe an entire branch of the family. Imagine growing up knowing that something was once yours, not because you asked for it, but because you were born into it, and then being told it's gone. Not because of anything you did, but because of where you live, who your parents are, and how far the palace believes you've drifted. Now ask yourself, is that justice? Or is that strategy? Because within palace walls, Justice and strategy rarely mean the same thing. What makes this even more unsettling is how quickly the narrative has shifted. Just months ago, there were whispers about reconciliation, softening, bridges being quietly rebuilt. But this move? This does the opposite. It hardens lines. It closes doors. And it sends a signal that the future monarchy will not hesitate to act decisively, even if that decisiveness comes at an emotional cost. And if you're wondering whether this decision was debated, challenged, or resisted behind the scenes, you're not alone. Insiders suggest there were voices of concern, voices warning about backlash, voices reminding everyone that once children are involved, public sympathy shifts fast. But those voices, according to sources, did not carry the day. Because in moments like this, the monarchy doesn't ask, "How will this look?" It asks, "Will this protect the institution?" And that brings us to the most important point of all. This is not just about Archie and Lilibet. This is about what kind of monarchy Prince William intends to lead. A softer one, or a firmer, more disciplined crown that prioritizes structure over sentiment? Because by making this move now, before coronations, before transitions are complete, William isn't just shaping today's headlines. He's shaping tomorrow's rules. And that's why this announcement feels different, heavier, final. But here's the part that hasn't been discussed enough. The announcement didn't just say what was happening. It also said what wasn't. There was no mention of timelines, no mention of reversibility, no hint that this was temporary. And in royal language, silence is rarely accidental. Silence is often the loudest message of all, which leads us to the detail almost everyone missed on first reading. A single phrasing choice, a subtle distinction, a line that, according to insiders, changes the entire meaning of the announcement. Because once you notice it, you realize this wasn't just a removal, it was a declaration. And what that declaration truly means, who it protects, who it isolates, and who it puts on notice, is something we're only just beginning to understand. But before we can unpack that, before we can trace how this decision was formed, justified, and executed, we need to talk about the moment this all became inevitable. Because this story didn't begin with Prince William. It didn't begin with an announcement. It didn't even begin with Harry and Meghan stepping away. It began years ago, with a quiet shift in how the monarchy viewed loyalty, proximity, and control. And once that shift started, there was only ever going to be one ending. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Did you notice how fast it happened? One moment, everything felt frozen, speculation, whispers, headlines talking around the issue without touching the center. And then suddenly, movement. So here's the question that changes how you see everything that follows. When the royal family finally moves, is it ever spontaneous? Or is it simply the moment they decide the public is ready to hear what's already been decided? Because what came next wasn't chaos. It was choreography. This is the part of the story where the palace didn't just speak. It signaled. And if you understand how royal signaling works, you know something immediately felt off. The announcement didn't arrive during a crisis. It didn't follow a scandal. It wasn't framed as damage control. It arrived calmly, almost casually, as if the outcome had already been accepted somewhere far above public debate. And that's exactly what unsettled people who know the system. Because when the monarchy is nervous, it over-explains. When it's uncertain, it delays. But when it's confident, it releases a statement and lets silence do the rest. That's what happened here. No press conference, no emotional language, no softening phrases about family love or ongoing conversations. Just a clean, institutional acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. And suddenly, palace correspondents began scrambling, not to confirm whether it happened, but to understand how far it went. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. Royal announcements are not written to inform the public. They're written to bind the future. Every sentence is designed to close doors quietly while keeping others legally intact. And in this case, the wording did something extraordinary. It didn't describe a process. It described a state. That difference matters more than it seems. Because a process can be paused. A state is treated as fact. And once something is treated as fact inside the monarchy, reversing it becomes politically radioactive. That's why senior insiders didn't ask, "Is this real?" They asked, "Who signed off?" Because for something like this to be released, It must pass through layers of approval that don't move quickly and don't act emotionally, which tells us something important. This decision didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because of one argument, one interview, or one disagreement. It was the endpoint of a longer calculation. And if you trace it backward, you start to see the shape of the plan. The palace didn't begin by targeting the children. That would have been unthinkable optics. Instead, it began by redefining distance. Distance from royal duties. Distance from daily institutional life. Distance from the unspoken obligations that don't appear in any constitution but govern everything. At first, it was subtle. Language changed. Phrases like working royals became more rigid. Appearances were categorized. Absences were noted, quietly, without complaint. And every time distance increased, something else shrank. Influence. Access. Expectation. Because in the monarchy, presence equals power. And absence, even justified absence, slowly weakens claims that once felt automatic. Now here's where the contradiction emerges. Publicly, the royal family insisted that stepping back did not affect titles, birthright, or succession. And technically, that was true at the time. But privately, succession isn't just a list. It's a living framework that assumes proximity, loyalty, and future service. And when those assumptions collapse, the framework starts to wobble. That wobble is what the palace feared most. Because once succession becomes theoretical instead of practical, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is the enemy of monarchy. So the question becomes, how do you restore certainty without triggering rebellion? You don't argue. You don't explain. You normalize. You wait. You let time pass until the extraordinary begins to feel inevitable. And then, when the moment comes, you move decisively. That's what this announcement represents. Not a reaction, a conclusion. And notice something else. The announcement didn't come from a committee. It didn't come from Parliament. It came from the authority associated with the future of the crown. That's intentional, because even before formal transitions take place, influence shifts quietly. Power flows toward the person seen as tomorrow's constant. And insiders say that for some time now, decisions have been aligning around that reality. Which brings us to a deeply uncomfortable truth. This wasn't about punishment. It was about containment. The palace didn't want open conflict. It wanted closure. And the cleanest way to close a chapter without endless negotiation is to remove its relevance. That's what succession status represents. Relevance. Once removed, arguments lose leverage. Disputes lose urgency. Time does the rest. Now think about what that means emotionally. For the public, this is abstract. Names on a list, rules most people never read. But for a family, this is devastating. Because it draws a hard line not just between roles, but between futures. And here's where the silence becomes deafening. There was no immediate response. No counterstatement. No emotional appeal. Which tells us one of two things. Either negotiations are still happening behind closed doors, or the decision landed with such finality that responding publicly would only make things worse. Both possibilities are unsettling, and both suggest that what we're seeing is only the surface. Because if there was one thing missing from the announcement, it was reassurance. No line about remaining beloved members of the family. No language about unchanged personal bonds. Nothing to soften the institutional message. And that absence speaks volumes. It tells us the palace didn't want ambiguity. It wanted clarity, which raises the most important question yet. If this was clarity, what comes next? Because succession is not isolated. Once you adjust one part of the structure, pressure builds elsewhere. Security, funding, protocol, recognition. Each one is tied, directly or indirectly, to that single list. And once names are removed, other assumptions quietly fall away. That's why some insiders are calling this move the first domino. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's structural. And structures, once altered, reshape everything around them. Now here's the moment most people missed. The announcement didn't frame this as loss. It framed it as alignment. Alignment with residents. Alignment with responsibility. Alignment with future roles. That language isn't accidental. It implies that succession is conditional, not on blood alone, but on alignment with the institution's expectations. And that is a radical shift in tone. Because for generations, blood was enough. Service enhanced status, but didn't define it. Now, The implication is clear. Distance has consequences, and consequences can extend beyond the individual. That's the message that landed hardest inside palace walls. Not because it was cruel, but because it was precise. And when the monarchy becomes precise, it's usually because it feels cornered. Cornered by public scrutiny. Cornered by a changing world. Cornered by the fear that tradition alone may no longer protect it. So this wasn't just a decision about two children. It was a test case. A signal to the rest of the family. A statement about the kind of monarchy that is coming. One that values cohesion over compassion, stability over sentiment, and control over chaos. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because while the palace was focused on control, it underestimated something else. Perception. The moment the announcement went public, reactions didn't divide neatly. They fractured. Some saw strength. Others saw coldness. And many asked the same quiet question. If this can happen to them, what does loyalty really buy you? That question is now echoing far beyond the headlines. And it's about to collide with the one person at the center of all of this, the figure whose choices set this entire chain of events in motion. Because to understand why the palace moved this way, you have to understand why Prince William moved first. And once you see his position clearly, the announcement stops looking sudden. It starts looking inevitable. But the reason why now? Why this exact moment? Is where the real story begins. And that reason has nothing to do with the children themselves. Why would a future king move now? Not later, not quietly after a coronation, not buried in tradition, but here, in the open, when every word is scrutinized. That's the question that reframes everything. Because timing, in royal life, is never accidental. And when you examine the timing of this decision, you start to see something far more deliberate than impulse. This is the chapter where the story stops being about policy and starts being about power, about a man preparing to inherit not just a crown, but a fragile institution under pressure from every direction. So let's talk about Prince William, not the tabloid version, not the carefully staged balcony figure, but the strategist emerging behind the scenes. For years, William was described as cautious, measured, almost passive, someone who absorbed lessons rather than imposed them. But that image has been quietly outdated for some time now. Because while public attention fixated on drama elsewhere, William was doing something far more consequential. He was learning where the real levers of the monarchy actually are. Not the public speeches, not the ceremonies, not even the crown itself, but the systems beneath it. The mechanisms that decide who matters, who doesn't, and who remains permanently tied to the institution's future. And succession sits at the heart of that system. What many people misunderstand is this. A future king doesn't suddenly wake up one day with authority. Authority is accumulated. It's tested quietly, exercised in moments where resistance is unlikely or too costly. And insiders say this was one of those moments. Because William is stepping into a monarchy that is already under strain. Public trust isn't what it was. The media landscape is hostile and fragmented. Every internal disagreement risks becoming a global spectacle. And most importantly, the old assumption that blood alone guarantees loyalty no longer holds. That realization has changed everything. William isn't just thinking about today. He's thinking about a reign that could last decades. And the question he's reportedly asking behind closed doors is unsettlingly simple. How do you prevent instability before it starts? Not react to it. Prevent it. And that's where this decision begins to make sense. Because from William's perspective, the monarchy cannot afford permanent ambiguities. Not about who represents it. Distance, in his view, creates risk. Not emotional risk. Structural risk. Because when royal identity becomes optional, it weakens the institution's authority over those who remain. That's the fear driving this. And it's a fear shaped by observation. William watched what happened when lines blurred. He saw how partial engagement created confusion, how half-in, half-out arrangements fueled resentment internally and skepticism externally. And he learned a lesson from it. Ambiguity doesn't buy peace. It buys prolonged conflict. So instead of allowing the issue to linger, festering, resurfacing every few years, he chose clarity. Even if that clarity feels brutal. But here's the contradiction that makes this story so explosive. William is also deeply aware of optics. He understands sympathy cycles. He knows public opinion can turn fast. So why take a step that invites accusations of coldness, even cruelty? Because there's another calculation at play, not about who benefits from it, and not about who can claim legitimacy, and yet, the decision moved forward. Why? Because from William's perspective, the greater danger wasn't backlash. It was precedent. If children raised entirely outside the institution remain embedded in its future power structure, it raises questions the monarchy can't answer cleanly. Questions about allegiance. Questions about influence. Questions about who ultimately speaks for the crown. William wants a monarchy that knows exactly where it stands. And that means narrowing the definition of belonging. Now here's the moment that changes how you see everything. Sources suggest this wasn't a unilateral decision. It was the result of alignment among a small, powerful group inside the royal ecosystem. Advisors, legal minds, institutional guardians who think in decades, not news cycles. And once that alignment was reached, the outcome became inevitable. At that point, the announcement wasn't a gamble. It was execution. Which explains the calm tone, the lack of emotional cushioning, the confidence in silence. Because when power feels secure, it doesn't over-explain. It asserts. But there's one more layer here, one that complicates William's image even further. This decision also sends a message to the next generation of royals, a signal that proximity matters, that commitment is expected, that stepping away has consequences beyond the individual. William is defining the rules of engagement for a modern monarchy. And those rules are stricter than many expected. But here's the risk he's taking. Control can stabilize, but it can also alienate. And once you alienate, you lose something harder to quantify: goodwill. Which raises a critical question. Is William betting that institutional strength outweighs emotional fallout? Because if he is, then this decision marks the beginning of a far firmer reign than anyone anticipated. And that firmness won't stop here. This is why some insiders believe this announcement is not the end. It's the beginning of a recalibration, one that will affect roles, funding, and visibility across the royal family. Because once you redefine succession, you redefine everything downstream. And that's what makes this moment so pivotal. Not because of who was removed, but because of what was revealed. A future king who values clarity over compromise, structure over sentiment, and decisive action over prolonged negotiation. But the most dangerous part of this story hasn't unfolded yet, because every assertion invites a response, and silence, eventually, becomes unsustainable. The question is not whether there will be a reaction, it's where it will come from. And when it does, it may expose fractures the palace hoped to contain. Because the next phase of this story doesn't belong to William. It belongs to the people whose lives were just quietly rewritten. And once they decide how, or whether, to respond, everything changes again. What happens when the people affected by a decision choose not to speak? At first, silence looks like acceptance. But in royal history, silence is often something else entirely. A pause, a calculation, a moment where the weight of consequences is being measured against the power of response. And that's exactly where this story goes next. Because once the announcement settled, once the headlines stopped refreshing every few seconds, attention turned to one place. Not the palace, not the advisors, not even Prince William. It turned to Prince Harry. And the question everyone started asking, quietly at first, then louder by the hour, was simple. How does a man respond when his children's futures are altered without his consent? Not criticized, not debated, altered. For years, Harry has been framed as reactive, emotional, unpredictable, someone who speaks first and deals with consequences later. But this moment, this demanded something else. Because reacting emotionally would only reinforce the narrative the palace is trying to end. And Harry knows that. So what we're seeing now is not weakness. It's restraint. And restraint, in this context, is dangerous. Because it suggests strategy. According to people close to the situation, Harry was not blindsided by the announcement. He was aware something was coming. Not the exact wording, not the finality, but the direction. Which means this wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. Confirmation that the distance he created has now been formalized, institutionalized. And that realization lands differently than public criticism ever did. Because criticism can be ignored. But institutional decisions? They follow you forever. Now think about the position Harry is in. If he speaks out, he risks appearing to fight the monarchy through his children. If he stays silent, he risks appearing complicit in their exclusion. Either way, the optics are unforgiving. And that's exactly why this moment is so powerful. Because the palace has placed him in a position where every possible response carries a cost. That's not accidental. That's leverage. But here's the contradiction most people are missing. Harry no longer depends on royal leverage. Financially, emotionally, or symbolically, which changes the balance entirely. He doesn't need restoration. He doesn't need permission. What he needs now is narrative control. And narrative control doesn't come from immediate statements. It comes from timing, from letting the public absorb the implications before offering interpretation. That's why the silence matters. Because behind that silence, something else is happening. Reframing. Sources suggest Harry is not focused on reversing the decision. He's focused on redefining what it means. And that distinction is crucial. Because fighting the palace on its own terms is a losing game. The monarchy has time. It has structure. It has endurance. But Harry has something else. Freedom. And freedom allows you to change the question instead of answering it. Instead of asking, why were my children removed from succession? The reframed question becomes, why does succession matter in the first place? That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. Because once succession is framed as outdated, exclusion loses its sting. And that's where this story becomes far more complex. Because the palace assumed succession still carries unquestioned value. And for the institution, it does. But for the public, that assumption is eroding. Which means this decision could produce the opposite effect of what was intended. Instead of weakening Harry's position, it could free him from a framework he no longer wants. And that creates a new risk. Not for Harry, for the monarchy. Because if the children grow up unburdened by royal expectation, they also grow up beyond royal control. No obligations, no restrictions, no institutional loyalty, just names. And names, without power, become symbols. Symbols the palace can't manage. Now let's talk about the emotional layer no one wants to acknowledge. Because for all the strategy, all the positioning, this is still about a father. A father watching an institution decide something irreversible about his children. Even if he anticipated it. Even if he prepared for it. There's a difference between knowing something might happen and watching it become official. That's where this decision cuts deepest. And that's why those close to Harry say the reaction wasn't explosive. It was quiet, contained, heavy, because the finality of it removed something intangible. Hope. Not hope of returning, but hope that lines could remain blurred. Now they're sharp, and sharp lines create clarity, but also wounds. What's fascinating is how this clarity forces a reevaluation of everything that came before. Every interview, every statement, every accusation of betrayal. In hindsight, they all begin to look like steps toward this moment. As if the palace was slowly building justification, and Harry was slowly building independence. Two trajectories moving away from each other. Until finally, there was nothing left to negotiate. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Did the palace underestimate Harry's willingness to walk away permanently? Because this move doesn't pressure him to return. It removes the incentive. And without incentive, reconciliation becomes symbolic rather than strategic. Now consider this. If Harry chooses never to respond publicly, if he allows this decision to stand without comment, the palace owns it. It becomes their defining action, not his reaction. And that puts all the moral weight back where it started. On the institution, on the future king, on the choice to prioritize structure over empathy. That's a risky position, especially in a media environment that thrives on perceived injustice. And that's why some insiders are uneasy. They expected resistance, pushback, noise. Instead, they got stillness. And stillness creates space. Space for public interpretation. Space for sympathy to shift. Space for the narrative to evolve beyond palace control. Now ask yourself something. If Harry eventually speaks, not in anger, not in accusation, but in calm reflection, which voice will carry more weight? The institution defending tradition? Or the father explaining distance? That's the gamble embedded in this moment. And it's not a small one. Because once the public emotional center of the story moves, it doesn't move back easily. This is why some believe the most consequential phase of this saga hasn't begun yet. Because responses don't always come immediately. Sometimes they come years later. In choices, in paths taken, in lives lived visibly beyond the institution that once defined them. And that's what terrifies traditionalists. Because a royal child raised entirely outside the monarchy becomes proof that the crown is optional, not destiny, optional. And once that idea takes hold, succession loses its mystique. Which brings us to the quiet fear behind this announcement, that by formalizing distance, the palace may have accelerated irrelevance. Not today, not tomorrow, but generationally. And that's why this story isn't over. Because while the palace closed a door, it may have opened another one it cannot close. One where legitimacy is questioned not through protest, but through indifference. And that's far more dangerous. Because indifference doesn't fight the crown. It simply stops caring about it. And once that happens, the institution loses the very thing it depends on, belief. But the next chapter of this story doesn't depend on Harry alone. There's another figure whose role is about to become unavoidable. Someone whose presence or absence could shift everything again. And the palace knows it. What happens when the one person everyone expects to speak doesn't? Because after the silence from Harry settled in, after commentators exhausted the same tired questions, attention shifted again. Slowly at first, then all at once, to Meghan Markle. And here's the uncomfortable truth the palace understands better than anyone. Meghan doesn't need to say a word for her presence to be felt. Her silence carries its own gravity, its own narrative, its own threat. For years, the story around Meghan has been loud. Too loud. Every movement dissected. Every expression interpreted. Every absence treated like an insult. But in this moment, this precise, delicate, institutional moment, she has done something unexpected. She has disappeared. No statement. No leak. No carefully timed quote from a close source. Nothing. And that absence is not accidental. Because Meghan understands something fundamental about power. Sometimes the strongest move is to remove yourself from the board entirely and let everyone else reveal their hand. Now ask yourself this. If Meghan were to respond emotionally, what would happen? The focus would shift instantly. From the palace's decision, to her reaction, from institutional authority, to personal grievance. And that would let the monarchy off the hook. She knows that, which is why this moment is so unsettling for those inside the system. Because Meghan has been cast, for years, as the disruptor, the lightning rod, the one who speaks when silence would be safer. But here, she has chosen the opposite. And that choice reframes everything. Because without her reaction, the palace owns the optics. And those optics are stark. An ancient institution altering the futures of children. Quietly, decisively, without visible compassion. That's not a comfortable image to sit with. Which is why some insiders privately hoped she would speak. They wanted the familiar conflict. The familiar framing. Anything to pull attention away from the decision itself. But that didn't happen. And now the story is stuck where the palace least wants it. On the decision. On the structure. On the question of whether tradition has crossed into rigidity. And here's the contradiction that makes this even more dangerous. Meghan doesn't need royal validation. She doesn't need titles. She doesn't need succession. Her public identity exists entirely outside the institution, which means the usual levers don't work on her. Removing her children from the line of succession doesn't diminish her platform. It may actually strengthen it, because now, any future success her children have will be framed as independent, unburdened, self-made. And that narrative plays very differently in the modern world. That's something the monarchy struggles with, because its power depends on inherited legitimacy, on continuity, on the idea that belonging to the institution confers meaning. But Meghan represents a different model, one where meaning is created externally, through visibility, through choice, through autonomy. And that's why this moment matters far beyond the palace, because it sets up a collision between two value systems, one ancient, one modern, and neither is willing to fully acknowledge the other. Now let's talk about what's happening behind closed doors. Because while Meghan hasn't spoken publicly, sources suggest conversations are happening privately, not with the palace, but with advisors, strategists, people who understand media cycles and long-term positioning. And the consensus emerging from those conversations is telling. This is not a battle to be fought immediately. It's a narrative to be lived out over time. Because unlike the monarchy, Meghan doesn't need permanence. She needs momentum. And momentum is built through action, not statements. That's why some believe the most powerful response won't come in words. It will come in choices, where the children are educated, how they're presented publicly, what values are emphasized, and crucially, what they are never shown asking for. Permission, because the moment they thrive visibly outside royal structures, the palace's decision begins to look less like strength and more like insecurity. That's the risk the institution took. It assumed exclusion would reduce relevance. But relevance doesn't disappear. It transforms. And sometimes, it transforms into something harder to control. Now consider the emotional dimension again. Meghan has been accused, repeatedly, of prioritizing independence over tradition, of choosing distance over duty, of valuing personal well-being over institutional expectation. This decision validates that choice, retroactively. Because if the institution was always willing to redraw boundaries this decisively, then independence was never a betrayal. It was a safeguard. And that reframing is powerful. It turns years of criticism into foresight. And foresight earns sympathy. Which brings us to the audience reaction that the palace didn't fully anticipate. People aren't asking, what did Meghan do wrong? They're asking, why did it come to this? That shift matters. Because it places responsibility back on the institution, on its rigidity, on its unwillingness to tolerate difference. And once the public begins to see this as an institutional failure rather than a personal one, the narrative becomes very difficult to steer. That's why the next phase of this story isn't about statements. It's about visibility. Every appearance, every absence, every life choice will now be interpreted through this lens, not as rebellion, but as consequence. And here's the part that makes palace strategists uneasy. Meghan doesn't need to criticize the monarchy anymore. She doesn't need to expose it. It has exposed itself by choosing structure over empathy, finality over flexibility, control over connection. And those choices linger. They don't disappear with the next news cycle. They accumulate, which is why some insiders believe this decision will be studied for years, not as a moment of strength, but as a turning point. A moment when the monarchy revealed how it handles difference and what it's willing to sacrifice to preserve coherence. But here's the twist no one is talking about yet. Meghan's silence isn't just strategic. It's protective, because once you speak, you invite engagement, debate, rebuttal. By saying nothing, she denies the institution that opportunity. She lets the decision stand alone, unchallenged, unsoftened, and that's far more destabilizing than open conflict. Because now, the palace has no one to argue with, only its own reflection. And reflections can be unforgiving. But this still isn't the most dangerous part of the story. Because while Harry and Meghan navigate this moment quietly, there are forces outside the family that are beginning to pay attention. Legal minds, political observers, historians, people who understand that succession isn't just a family matter. It's a constitutional one. And once those voices enter the conversation, the stakes change again. Because this decision may not stay confined to palace walls. It may invite scrutiny from places the monarchy prefers to avoid. And once that happens, control becomes an illusion. But to understand why that scrutiny matters, we need to step back, away from personalities, away from emotion, and into the cold machinery of royal law and precedent. Because buried beneath this announcement is a legal reality that could complicate everything. And once that reality is fully understood, the palace may discover that clarity comes with a cost it didn't anticipate. What happens when a royal decision stops being emotional and starts being constitutional? Because this is the moment where the story shifts again, away from personalities, away from silence and strategy, and straight into the machinery the monarchy depends on, but rarely wants the public to examine too closely. This is the part no one puts on the front page. Because it's complicated, because it's uncomfortable, and because once people understand it, the illusion of absolute royal control starts to crack. Here's the mini hook that changes everything. Can a future king actually remove someone from the line of succession on his own? Not symbolically, not rhetorically, but legally. Because while the announcement felt decisive, insiders and constitutional observers immediately noticed something strange. The confidence didn't match the complexity. And when confidence moves faster than law, friction follows. Most people assume royal succession is a private family matter, a list managed internally, a tradition guarded by the palace. A hierarchy adjusted quietly as circumstances change. But that assumption is only half true. Because succession isn't just tradition. It's law. And law doesn't move as easily as press releases. This is where things get uncomfortable. And that's where the gray area begins. Because there's a difference between saying someone is no longer expected to perform royal functions and saying they no longer exist within the legal order of succession. One is administrative. The other is constitutional. And conflating the two is dangerous. This is why legal scholars started paying attention immediately. Not because they sympathize with any individual involved, but because they recognize a familiar pattern. Institutions often test boundaries quietly first. They see how far language can stretch before resistance appears. And if resistance doesn't appear, that stretch becomes normalized. But normalization doesn't make something lawful. It just makes it unchallenged, at least for a while. Now ask yourself this. Why would the palace choose wording that feels definitive but avoids explicit legal triggers? Because explicit legal triggers require explicit processes. Parliamentary acknowledgement. Cross-realm consultation. Formal ratification in countries where the monarch is still head of state. That's not quick. That's not quiet. And it's certainly not controllable in the same way. So instead, the palace framed this as alignment. Alignment with residents. Alignment with future roles. Alignment with institutional expectations. All language that implies inevitability without formally declaring it. Which is clever, but also risky. Because clever wording doesn't override law. It only delays confrontation with it. And that's where the story becomes volatile. Because once legal minds begin asking questions publicly, the palace has two bad options. Clarify and potentially walk back the implied finality. Or double down and invite constitutional scrutiny. Neither is attractive. Clarification weakens authority. Doubling down risks exposure. This is why some insiders are deeply uneasy right now. Not because they think the palace acted illegally, but because they know ambiguity invites challenge. And challenges don't always come from the people you expect. This isn't about Harry filing a lawsuit. This isn't about Meghan making a statement. This is about external observers, journalists, historians, constitutional experts, asking questions the palace can't easily silence. Questions like, is this decision symbolic or binding? If symbolic, why present it as final? If binding, where is the legal process? And most importantly, what precedent does this set? Because precedent is everything in constitutional systems. Once something appears to happen without consequence, it becomes easier to repeat. And that's why this moment matters far beyond this family. Because if succession can be altered through administrative language, what else can be quietly redefined? That question makes people nervous. Not royalists. Institutionalists. The people whose job is to ensure stability through clarity. And clarity is exactly what's missing right now. Which is why some believe this announcement was intentionally designed to sit in the gray. Firm enough to signal intent. Vague enough to avoid immediate legal confrontation. It's a balancing act. But balancing acts don't last forever. Eventually, weight shifts. And something gives. Now here's the contradiction that makes this explosive. The monarchy thrives on continuity. On the perception that everything is orderly, stable, and governed by rules that don't change on a whim. But this announcement feels abrupt, decisive, almost executive. And that tone clashes with the slow, procedural nature of constitutional change. Which means even supporters of the monarchy are uneasy. Not because they oppose the outcome, but because they don't like how it looks. Because once the monarchy starts behaving like it can rewrite fundamentals without process, it invites the exact scrutiny it usually avoids. And that scrutiny doesn't fade. It compounds. Now think about what happens next. If the palace clarifies that this was symbolic, not legal, the public asks why it was framed so dramatically. If it insists the change is substantive, the public asks where the legal backing is. Either way, the institution is forced to explain itself. And explanation is not the monarchy's strength. Its strength is mystique, authority, assumed legitimacy. And every explanation chips away at that. This is why some believe the palace expected the story to burn fast and fade. A sharp announcement, a short news cycle, then silence. But that's not what's happening. Because the more people look at the decision, the more they realize how many unanswered questions it creates. And unanswered questions don't disappear. They wait. They resurface, often at the worst possible moment, which leads us to the most dangerous possibility of all, that this decision may eventually force a reckoning the palace never intended, a moment where it must choose between institutional clarity and institutional control, because clarity requires openness, and openness exposes limits. And limits are something the monarchy is deeply uncomfortable acknowledging. So while this announcement was meant to close a chapter, it may have opened a much larger one that moves the conversation away from family drama and into constitutional territory. And once the story enters that space, the palace no longer sets the rules alone, which is exactly why the next phase of this saga is so unpredictable, because it won't be driven by emotion, or strategy, or silence. It will be driven by scrutiny, and scrutiny doesn't care about intention, only outcome. But before that scrutiny fully takes shape, before legal and historical voices dominate the conversation, there is one more factor the palace is counting on: public fatigue. The hope that attention will drift, that complexity will bore, that people will move on. The question is, what happens if they don't? Because if this moment lingers, if it becomes a case study rather than a headline, then the palace may find itself answering questions it never expected to face. And once those questions are asked, they cannot be unasked. What if the palace's biggest gamble isn't legal, but psychological? Because as constitutional questions simmer, there's another force the monarchy is counting on, and it has nothing to do with statutes or precedent. It's exhaustion, the quiet hope that complexity will dull outrage, that nuance will drain urgency, that people will shrug and move on because the rules are too dense, the details too technical, the consequences too abstract. That hope has saved the monarchy before, but this time, something is different. Because this story isn't complicated where it counts. At its core, it's simple. Children were affected. A future was altered, and it happened without visible debate. You don't need a law degree to feel the weight of that. And that's why public fatigue may not arrive on schedule, because fatigue requires distance. And this story refuses to create any. Every angle pulls you closer. Family versus institution. Tradition versus modern values. Authority versus empathy. And right now, empathy is winning the emotional battle. That's the part the palace underestimated. They assumed that by framing this as alignment, process, and structure, the public would disengage. Instead, people leaned in. Because alignment sounds neutral, but its consequences aren't. Now here's where the psychology of monarchy comes into play. The institution survives not because people understand it, but because they accept it. Acceptance doesn't come from logic. It comes from belief. Belief that the system is fair, even when it's strict. Belief that tradition protects the innocent. Belief that power restrains itself. This decision shook that belief. Not shattered it, but cracked it. And cracks are dangerous. Because once people see them, they start looking for others. That's why conversations are shifting. Not is this allowed, but should this be allowed? That shift is subtle, but it's everything. Because is about rules. Should is about values. And values are where the monarchy is most vulnerable. Now consider how this plays out over time. If public attention fades, the palace wins. The decision becomes background noise. A footnote. An accepted fact. But if attention lingers, if people keep asking why, if commentators keep revisiting the emotional core, then the institution faces a long-term problem. Not rebellion, reevaluation. And reevaluation doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, in opinion polls, in cultural commentary, in the way younger generations talk about relevance. That's the danger. Not anger. Apathy. Because anger can be managed. Apathy cannot. Now let's talk about the internal calculation again. Because while the palace is outwardly calm, there are signs of unease. Not panic, but caution. Language is being measured. Leaks have slowed. Briefings are tightly controlled. That tells us something. The institution is waiting. Waiting to see which direction the public mood settles. Waiting to see if silence will do the work it usually does. And waiting is a risky strategy. Because silence doesn't just suppress reaction. It also creates space for interpretation. And interpretation is where narratives escape control. That's already happening. Some people see this as strength. Others see it as rigidity. But a growing number see it as something else entirely. Fear. Fear of unpredictability. Fear of losing control over the narrative of royal legitimacy. Fear that the monarchy's future depends on narrowing the circle instead of expanding it. And narrowing always comes with cost. Because exclusion sends a message. Even when it's legally justified. Even when it's strategically sound. The message is simple. Belonging is conditional. And conditional belonging erodes loyalty. Now ask yourself this. If you're a younger member of the royal family watching this unfold, what do you learn? That stepping away has consequences. That independence carries risk. That alignment matters more than affection. That lesson may create discipline, but it also creates distance. And distance is not something the monarchy can afford indefinitely, because its survival depends on continuity, on the willingness of future generations to participate willingly, not out of fear, but out of belief. This decision leans heavily on fear. Fear of fragmentation, fear of ambiguity, fear of losing narrative control. And fear-driven systems are stable, until they're not. Because fear doesn't inspire, it constrains. And constrained systems eventually face pressure from within. Now here's the twist. The palace may believe it has time, that decades of institutional momentum will carry it forward regardless of short-term discomfort. And historically, that belief hasn't been wrong. But the context has changed. The modern world doesn't wait decades to reassess institutions. It reassesses them constantly, in real time, on social platforms, in global conversations. Across borders, the monarchy no longer controls, which means every decision now exists in a feedback loop. Immediate reaction, long-term consequence, reputation erosion, or reinforcement. And this decision entered that loop at a disadvantage, because it didn't arrive with a story people could emotionally accept. There was no visible compassion, no explanation, no sense of reluctance, just outcome. An outcome without context invites judgment. Now imagine how this will look 5 years from now. 10. When the children grow older. When they ask questions. When their lives become visible in ways the palace can't curate. Every milestone will reopen this conversation. Every public appearance will invite comparison. Every success will raise the same quiet thought. They didn't need the monarchy. And that thought undermines everything succession is meant to represent. Which brings us to the question the palace is hoping no one asks too loudly. What if this decision doesn't strengthen the monarchy, but accelerates its transformation into something narrower, colder, and less relevant? Because institutions don't usually collapse from one dramatic moment. They hollow out, gradually, through decisions that prioritize control over connection. And this decision fits that pattern. Now here's the part no one inside the palace wants to admit. There was another option. A messier one. A slower one. A more emotionally complicated one. One that kept lines blurred. One that preserved flexibility. But flexibility invites negotiation. And negotiation requires humility. And humility is hard for institutions built on inherited authority. So instead, the palace chose finality. And finality feels powerful, until its consequences arrive. Which brings us to where this story is heading next. Because public fatigue isn't guaranteed. And if it doesn't arrive, if scrutiny continues, if the emotional narrative hardens against the institution, then the palace will face a choice. Double down, or soften. And both options carry risk. Doubling down confirms rigidity. Softening admits miscalculation. Neither restores the original illusion. So the real question becomes, what is the monarchy willing to sacrifice to preserve control? Because this decision already sacrificed something. It sacrificed the assumption that children are beyond institutional consequence. Once that assumption is gone, nothing feels fully protected anymore. And that changes how people perceive the crown, not as a unifying symbol, but as a governing body willing to draw bloodlines sharply. That perception, once formed, is very hard to reverse. Which is why the next phase of this story is so dangerous. Because it won't be driven by headlines. It will be driven by memory, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of doubt. And doubt doesn't need proof to spread. It only needs plausibility. This decision made doubt plausible. But here's the part that could upend everything. There is one moment coming, not announced, not scheduled, that could force the palace to confront all of this publicly. A moment when silence will no longer be an option. A moment when clarity will be demanded, not by critics, but by circumstance. And when that moment arrives, The monarchy will have to answer a question it's been avoiding. Was this decision about stability, or was it about fear? Because the answer to that question will define the institution's future far more than any line of succession ever could. And that moment? It's closer than anyone wants to admit. What if the moment the palace is dreading isn't a scandal, but a question? Because institutions can survive outrage. They can weather protests, criticism, even ridicule. What they struggle with is inquiry. Calm, persistent, unavoidable inquiry. And that moment is approaching. Not because someone plans to force it, but because time has a way of dragging unresolved decisions into the light. This is the chapter where the monarchy's strategy meets reality, where silence stops working, and where the cost of finality begins to surface in ways no press office can contain. Here's the question that reframes everything again. What happens when the children grow up? Not tomorrow, not next year, but soon enough that they start asking their own questions. Because succession isn't just about lists and legality. It's about narrative inheritance, about what a child is told when they ask, "Where do I fit?" And there is no institution more dependent on narrative continuity than the monarchy. This is the long game the palace may not have fully accounted for. Because while institutions think in terms of decades, children experience time differently. They don't see strategy. They feel exclusion. They don't understand alignment. They understand absence. And absence has a way of echoing. Now imagine that future. A moment, years from now, when the question is no longer hypothetical. When a child asks why they are not part of something their birth once guaranteed. There is no neutral answer to that. No legal explanation that doesn't carry emotional weight. No institutional language that doesn't sound cold when spoken aloud. That's the reckoning embedded in this decision. And it's one the palace cannot indefinitely delay. Because eventually, the story stops being told by officials and starts being told by people who lived it. That's what makes this different from previous royal controversies. This isn't about reputation. It's about memory. And memory, once formed, is uncontrollable. The palace understands this, even if it doesn't say it publicly. That's why there is unease behind the scenes. Not panic, but awareness. Awareness that this decision didn't close a chapter. It wrote one. And chapters get revisited, especially when they involve children. Now consider how public perception evolves over time. At first, people argue. Then they debate. Eventually, they settle into interpretation. And interpretations harden. Right now, the dominant interpretation is still forming. But the emotional direction is clear. People are less interested in rules, and more interested in fairness. Less interested in tradition, and more interested in humanity. And once that shift happens, institutions lose their home field advantage. Because they are built to defend rules, not feelings. This is why the palace is counting on fatigue. But fatigue doesn't always arrive. Sometimes, stories don't burn out. They smolder. They resurface at anniversaries, at milestones, at moments of visibility. And each time they resurface, they pick up new layers, new context, new resonance. Now think about what could trigger that resurfacing. A birthday, a graduation, a public appearance, a single photograph. Any moment where the absence of royal recognition becomes visible again. Every one of those moments reopens the question the palace hoped to settle. Why? And every time that question is asked, it chips away at the original justification. Because justifications age poorly. They rely on context that fades. Emotion, on the other hand, compounds. This is why some insiders quietly fear that this decision has set a clock in motion. Not a countdown to crisis, but a slow drift toward reassessment. Because once a story becomes generational, it stops being manageable. The monarchy has always relied on time being on its side. This time, time may be working against it. Now here's the contradiction that makes this moment so precarious. The palace acted to prevent uncertainty, but in doing so, it may have created a different kind of uncertainty. One that doesn't show up in legal documents, but in public trust. Because trust depends on the belief that power restrains itself, that it protects the vulnerable, that it recognizes limits. And this decision tested that belief. Not catastrophically, but visibly, which is enough. Now let's talk about the future of the institution itself. Because every monarchy eventually faces a choice. Expand inclusion, or narrow control. Historically, narrowing control feels safer. It reduces variables, limits exposure. simplifies governance. But it also reduces resilience. Because resilience comes from adaptability, from the ability to absorb difference without breaking. And this decision suggests a monarchy less interested in absorbing difference and more interested in isolating it. That's a philosophical shift, not just a procedural one. And philosophical shifts define eras. They shape how history remembers decisions, not by what they achieved,